My son's wedding was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. I dreamed of that moment for years, imagining what it would be like to see my little boy at the altar, a smile on his face, ready to start his own family. But reality was far from the dream. When I arrived at the ceremony venue, an elegant ballroom in a 5-star hotel in downtown Boston, I was greeted with cold stares and forced smiles. The lobby was decorated with arrangements of white orchids and crystals that reflected the light from dozens of chandeliers. Elegantly dressed guests circulated with glasses of champagne, chatting animatedly. I felt immediately out of place, despite the navy blue dress I'd purchased especially for the occasion. The receptionist, a young blonde with a headset and a clipboard, consulted a list, frowning as if my name were a typo. Her eyes scanned several pages before finally settling. Here. Eleanor Jenkins. The way she said my name held a slight intonation of surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to actually show up. After a few awkward moments, she handed me a card with my table number on it. Table 27. I stared at the small card printed in gold calligraphy, trying to maintain my composure. Can I see where this table is? I asked, trying to sound casual. Of course, she replied with a mechanical smile. It's in the last section of the main hall, near the emergency exit. The last row of the ballroom, practically hidden behind a column, far from the main stage where the bride and groom would be seated. I swallowed the lump in my throat and moved on, telling myself it didn't matter where I sat, as long as I could see my son get married. I adjusted the faux pearl necklace that had been a gift from Jonathan when he was just 12. He'd saved his allowance for months to buy it for Mother's Day. At the time, he'd said I deserved real jewelry like his friends' mothers, but that one day he'd give me diamonds. The memory of that loving, thoughtful boy seemed so distant now. I walked down the main aisle, trying to hold my head high, clutching my small party bag I'd bought especially for the occasion at a department store during a sale. 3 payments were made on my credit card, a sacrifice I made without hesitation because I wanted to look presentable at my only son's wedding. I noticed the stares of people I didn't know, the bride's guests whispering as I passed. I recognized a few stray words. His mother, alone, poor thing, nowhere to fall dead. Each whisper was like a tiny needle piercing my heart, but I kept walking, smiling as if nothing were happening, as if oblivious to the barely concealed disdain. A woman in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary nudged her friend as I passed. That's her, Jonathan's mother. Patricia told me she works as an accountant for some small company. She barely managed to pay for her son's college education. If it weren't for Richard and Susan's generosity. They chuckled softly, not caring if I heard or not. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was here for Jonathan, not for these people who meant nothing to me. Even though my own son seemed increasingly like an outsider, absorbed in the Moore world and its superficial values. When I finally reached table 27, I found others who seemed equally out of place. A distant cousin of Jonathan's whom he barely knew, a former co-worker who seemed bored, repeatedly glancing at his watch, an elderly woman dozing lightly, and a gentleman in an impeccable suit, grey hair, and wire-frame glasses who didn't quite fit in that forgotten corner of the room. His elegant posture and the perfect cut of his Italian suit contrasted with the obviously secondary nature of our table. He seemed out of place, like a VIP guest accidentally placed in the wrong section. I sat silently, adjusting the dress I'd saved for months to buy. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it represented the best I could offer at that moment. The price tag still made me cringe when I thought about it, even though I knew it was probably what the guests in the main section spent on a casual luncheon. I tried not to think about how much I'd sacrificed raising my son alone, the sleepless nights when he was sick with a high fever and I couldn't afford health insurance, the extra hours I'd worked to pay for his soccer lessons, the meals I'd skipped so he could have new sneakers and avoid being ridiculed by his schoolmates. I tried not to remember how, little by little, he drifted away after meeting Patricia, his fiancée, a young woman from a wealthy family who never hid her contempt for me and my humble origins. How his visits to my apartment became more rare, his calls shorter, always with excuses about how busy he was with the job his father-in-law had arranged for him, or with the wedding preparations from which I was practically excluded. How he stopped mentioning our life together, the sacrifices we'd made, as if ashamed of his past, of me. "Are the seats assigned, or can I sit here?" asked the man in the impeccable suit, indicating the empty chair next to me. "There are no appointments on this table," I replied with a polite smile. "Apparently we're not important enough for that." He laughed softly, a genuine warm sound that seemed out of place in this setting. A shrewd observation. Maybe we're too important to be controlled by name cards. His unexpected response made me smile, the first real smile of the day. He sat gracefully, adjusting his suit without any wasted movement. "Charles Williams," he introduced himself, extending his hand politely. "And you must be Eleanor, Jonathan's mother." I nodded, surprised that someone recognized me, even more surprised that they knew my name. "Yes, it's me. Do you know my son?" "Not personally," he replied with an enigmatic smile. "But I know a lot about him. I'm the lawyer in charge of the trust fund," he continued casually, as if commenting on the weather. "Trust fund," I repeated, confused. "What trust fund?" "The $45 million trust Ryan established for Jonathan before he left," Charles explained calmly, taking a sip of water. "I assumed you knew, though the instructions were to keep it confidential until the appropriate time." I smiled, not fully understanding, thinking it might be some kind of elaborate joke, but before I could ask anything, the lights dimmed and the ceremony began. Soft music filled the room, and all the guests turned their attention to the entrance of the hall. I decided to save my questions for later, even though my mind was full of them. Had Ryan, my ex-husband, the man who abandoned us when Jonathan was just 5, left $1 million trust fund? It seemed impossible. The Ryan I knew could barely make the rent at the end of the month. I watched my son enter the hall, elegant in his Armani suit, the boy I'd raised alone now a man. His perfectly coiffed brown hair, his confident smile, his erect posture, these were all parts of him I recognized. But there was something else, a superficial layer of polish, a veneer of sophistication that seemed borrowed, not truly his. He was accompanied by Richard Moore, his future father-in-law and seemingly his new mentor, who guided him down the aisle as if Jonathan were his newly acquired property. I saw the look of pride on Richard's face, not a father's pride in his son, but a collector's pride in a prized possession. I watched the bride enter with her mother, Susan, in a Vera Wang gown that probably cost more than everything I've ever owned. Patricia looked stunning, there was no denying it, with her long blonde hair pulled back in an elaborate bun, her flawless makeup highlighting her blue eyes, and the silk and lace gown designed especially for her. But there was something about her smile that always bothered me, a calculating quality, an underlying coldness that Jonathan, in his dazzlement, seemed unaware of. I watched the vows being exchanged, the words of eternal love spoken beneath an arch of exotic flowers imported from some distant land. I saw the platinum rings being placed, the kiss that sealed the union, the enthusiastic applause from the VIP guests in the front rows. And all the while, I sat at table 27, watching from afar, like a stranger in my own son's life. A surreal feeling enveloped me, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life, not that of the boy I'd cradled in my arms for countless nights. During the reception, while guests enjoyed themselves and danced to a live band playing contemporary hits mixed with timeless classics, Charles and I chatted. The main tables were served first, with attentive waiters offering elaborate dishes and expensive wines. Our table, as expected, was one of the last to receive attention. "You mentioned a trust fund," I began, keeping my voice low. $45 million? There must be some mistake. Ryan didn't have that kind of money. Charles smiled patiently. "There's no mistake, Eleanor. I'm the administrator of a trust fund set up by your ex-husband, Ryan, Jonathan's father. A fund that has been growing for over 2 decades, ever since Ryan left. It started with approximately $20 million and has grown significantly since then." I shook my head, still in disbelief. "That's impossible. Ryan worked as a salesman. We lived in a modest apartment. He left us with only $5,000 when he left." "Ryan Jenkins wasn't who you thought," Charles replied softly, his eyes revealing compassion. The full story is more complex than you realize, but this isn't the time to reveal it in its entirety. What I can say is that your ex-husband came from an extremely wealthy family, though he chose to live apart from that wealth for personal reasons. When he learned he was dying, he reconciled with his family and established the trust for Jonathan. Dying, I repeated, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under my feet. Was Ryan sick when he left us? Charles nodded solemnly. Terminal brain cancer. He didn't want you and Jonathan to see him waste away. It was a questionable decision, certainly, but one made with the intention of sparing you prolonged suffering. I felt tears welling up, but I held them back. 25 years of anger, resentment, and unanswered questions began to morph into something else, something I couldn't yet fully name. What about the trust fund? I asked, trying to process the information. Why didn't I ever know about it? The terms of the fund are very specific, Charles explained, as we watched the engaged couple dance their first dance as husband and wife. Jonathan doesn't know anything about him because his father stipulated that he would only receive the money if he demonstrated himself to be a man of character. And part of that assessment depended on how he treated you, his mother, the woman who stayed to raise his son when Ryan chose to leave. And who makes this assessment? You, Charles replied simply. Ryan left the final decision in your hands. He believed no one knew Jonathan's true character better than you. And you're here to observe and report. Document Jonathan's behavior, especially toward you, and present these observations when the time comes to make a decision. I glanced across the room, where Jonathan and Patricia milled among the distinguished guests, local politicians, corporate executives, friends of Boston's elite. Not once did he glance toward table 27, not once did he look to his mother to share his joy. And when would that be? I asked, still trying to absorb everything. Originally, when Jonathan turned 30. But given the current circumstances, your marriage, the clear negative influence of the Moore family, the way you've been treated, I believe we've reached a critical point. I suggest we reveal the existence of the fund tomorrow, in my office. As the guests danced and toasted the couple's future, I sat, smiling silently, knowing that fate had a strange sense of humor. The next day would bring a revelation that would change everything, and I would finally have the opportunity to show everyone who Eleanor Jenkins truly was. There's one more thing you should know, Charles added, bowing slightly. Half of the trust belongs to you, Eleanor. Ryan stipulated that you would receive your share regardless of the decision regarding Jonathan. His only condition was that you raise your son in the best possible way, something which, from what I've observed over the years, you've done admirably. $22.5 million. The number echoed in my mind like something otherworldly, incomprehensible in its magnitude. I, who had counted pennies to buy groceries at the end of the month, who had worked 2 jobs to pay the rent, who had mended clothes until the patches needed mending, was about to become a millionaire. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Why tell me this now? I asked finally. Why not before? Ryan's instructions were clear, to reveal everything only at the appropriate time. I've watched your life and Jonathan's discreetly over the years. Recently, I began to notice troubling changes in his behavior, especially after his involvement with the Moore family. And today, seeing how you've been treated in this marriage, how you've been relegated to the farthest table, away from your own son, I believe we've reached the tipping point Ryan anticipated. I looked at the newlyweds, dancing under twinkling lights, oblivious to the conversation that would fundamentally change their futures. Jonathan smiled at his new wife, completely engrossed in his gilded world of privilege and pretension. How would he react to discovering that his poor mother was about to receive a fortune? How would Patricia and her parents respond to the news that the man they treated as a charitable project, whom they had raised from his humble beginnings, was entitled to millions? Tomorrow at 10 o'clock in my office, Charles said, handing me a neat card with his address. Jonathan and Patricia will receive an email this evening informing them of a meeting regarding marriage legal matters. They won't know the true purpose until we get there. I tucked the card into my purse, feeling a strange calm wash over me. For years, I had felt helpless in the face of Patricia and her parents' disdain, hurt by Jonathan's growing indifference. Tomorrow, the tables would be turned in a way neither of them could have foreseen. "Thank you for telling me all this, Charles," she said sincerely, "even though it seems surreal." "I'm just doing my duty," he replied with a slight smile. Ryan may have made many mistakes, but he truly cared about you and Jonathan, in his own imperfect way. I believe that tomorrow we will finally do justice to his vision. This story begins long before that wedding. It begins 27 years ago, when I met Ryan Jenkins in a small coffee shop in downtown Boston. I was 22 years old and working as an administrative assistant at an insurance company, trying to pay for my night school accounting studies. I came from a lower middle-class family. My parents, both elementary school teachers, had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving me alone in the world with little more than memories and a few debts. The daily grind coffee shop was my little luxury, the only extravagance I allowed myself 3 times a week. A cup of coffee and half a sandwich, an hour to study between the end of the day and the start of night classes. It was on a rainy Tuesday in April that Ryan entered my life. He appeared waving a sodden umbrella, his suit slightly damp at the edges, his dark brown hair plastered to his forehead. There was something magnetic about him, not just the obvious beauty of his features, but a presence that made people notice when he entered a room. He was 32, I later discovered, 10 years older than me, with a confidence that came not just from age but from a seemingly settled life. Ryan sat at the counter, right next to me, the only available seat that busy afternoon. When I reached for the sugar, I spilled my coffee, creating a small flood that threatened my accounting books. Before I could react, he had already lifted the books with one hand while offering his napkin with the other, a swift and elegant move that prevented an academic disaster. "It looks like too much important material for a coffee bath," he commented with a smile that created little wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. "Advanced accounting," I explained, frantically wiping the damp edges of the book. "I have a test on Friday." "Ah, numbers. I've never been very good with them. I prefer people. Selling things, telling stories, that's my thing." "Salesperson?" I asked, trying not to sound disappointed. I'd met many salespeople in my few years of adulthood, and most were exactly as expected. Talkative, superficial, always ready with a catchphrase and a practiced smile. "Guilty," he admitted, raising his hands in theatrical surrender. "But I promise I only sell things people actually need. Or at least convince them they need." He winked self-deprecatingly. We talked for 20 minutes, long enough for me to finish my coffee and realize I was late for class. Ryan asked for my number, and against my better judgment, I gave it. I hadn't really expected him to call. Men like him weren't typically interested in women like me. Young, yes, but simple, unsophisticated, and unconnected, focused on building a stable life rather than having exciting adventures. But he called. That same night, at 9:47 p.m., exactly 7 minutes after my class ended. "Eleanor Jenkins?" "It's Ryan, the spilled coffee guy. I was wondering, would you like to have dinner with me on Saturday? I know a place that serves the best risotto in Boston." The romance was fast and intense, like an emotional roller coaster that didn't give me time to breathe or question. Ryan showed me a world I'd never known, restaurants with menus without prices listed, gifts that appeared without occasion, a silk scarf, a rare 19th century ledger, a silver bracelet, weekend getaways to places I'd only seen in magazines, the Hamptons, Martha's Vineyard, a secluded cabin in the Vermont mountains. He never talked much about his family or his past. "There's not much to tell," he'd say when I asked. "Estranged parents, mediocre education, no siblings. The interesting part of my life started when I met you." He was charming enough to make me forget I was avoiding answering, skillful in changing the subject to something more pleasant. My studies, our weekend plans, a new restaurant he wanted to introduce me to. 6 months later, we were married in a small civil ceremony, with only a few friends as witnesses. Neither of us had any close family. I had lost both of my parents, and Ryan said he was estranged from his family by choice. "Some families are toxic, Ellie," he explained the one time I pressed the issue. Sometimes the only healthy thing to do is cut ties completely. This created a special bond between us. It was just the two of us against the world, building our own family from scratch. We moved into a modest apartment in a middle-class residential neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, one for us, the other Ryan used as an office, a small balcony where I planted geraniums, and a kitchen where I tried, with mixed results, to master the culinary arts. Ryan continued working as a salesman, now for a medical equipment company. The job required frequent travel, sometimes disappearing for days at a time to visit clients in other states. I finished my accounting degree and got a job at a small local firm. The pay wasn't great, but it was stable and satisfying. On weekends, we explored Boston together, discovering small ethnic restaurants, spending hours in used bookstores, and visiting museums on free admission days. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. A year after the wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. It was unexpected. We'd vaguely discussed children as a future possibility, but there were no concrete plans. When I told Ryan, his reaction was complex, a mix of surprise, concern, and eventually cautious joy. "A baby," he murmured, placing his hand on my still flat belly. "Our own family." There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite decipher at the time. A shadow, a fear, perhaps. I attributed it to the natural anxiety of a father-to-be, the looming responsibility. Jonathan was born on a sunny March morning, after 18 hours of labor. It was the happiest day of my life, holding that little being in my arms, promising him all the love I could give. Ryan seemed equally delighted, though more distant than I expected. He held the baby with extreme care, almost reverence, but also with a kind of hesitation, as if afraid he might break this little life entrusted to us. In the following months, Ryan became even more absent. His business trips increased in frequency and duration. "I'm building something for us, Ellie," he explained when I questioned. "For Jonathan's future. I want him to have opportunities we've never had." I believed him, of course. Why wouldn't I? There were moments of genuine connection. Ryan sitting on the living room floor playing with Jonathan, teaching him to stack blocks. Nights we read to our son together, alternating character voices. Lazy Sundays when we made pancakes and pretended the outside world didn't exist. But these moments became increasingly rare as Jonathan grew older. Ryan began to miss important milestones. His first step, his first word, his first haircut. There was always a meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, an important client that needed to be followed up on, a sales convention in some distant city. Jonathan had just turned 5 when Ryan didn't come home one Thursday night. He'd left for a quick trip to New York, promising to be back for dinner on Friday. When he didn't show up or answer my calls, I began to worry. I called his office, his few friends, and local hospitals. Nothing. No accidents reported, no messages left, no clues to his whereabouts. On Sunday, when panic had fully set in, I received a letter by private messenger. The envelope was made of expensive paper, the kind we never bought for our everyday correspondence. Inside was a handwritten letter on the letterhead of a luxury hotel I didn't recognize. "Eleanor," the letter began, without the usual "dear" or "my love" that usually preceded my name in her notes. I had to leave. This life, our life together, wasn't what I expected, wasn't what I needed. I really tried to make it work, for you and for Jonathan, but I can't keep pretending. I need freedom, space to discover who I really am and what I want from life. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence a new impact that took my breath away. The letter continued, explaining that he had accepted an opportunity abroad, that it would be better for everyone if we made a clean break, that he trusted I would be strong enough to move on without him. Along with the letter was an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and the divorce papers he had already signed. Not a word about seeing his son again, not a single explanation that made sense to a 5-year-old who asked every day when Daddy would be home from work. The fear in his eyes when I couldn't answer, the way he began checking every room in the house when he got home from school, looking for a father who wasn't there, these images haunted me more than anything. Those were the darkest days of my life. Suddenly, I was a single mother, with a part-time job that barely covered the rent, an apartment we could no longer afford, and bills piling up on the kitchen table. I had to abandon my plans to major in accounting, take on another job as a cashier at a pharmacy on the weekends, and learn to be both a mother and a father. Jonathan cried at night, missing his father, confused by the sudden change in our lives. I cried after he fell asleep, missing the man I thought I knew and dreading the uncertain future that awaited us. It took selling nearly everything we owned and moving to a smaller apartment in a less desirable neighborhood to survive financially. The $5,000 Ryan left quickly evaporated between the deposit on the new apartment, some outstanding debts, and basic necessities while I adjusted to the new reality. 2 months after Ryan's disappearance, I received an unexpected visitor. Charles Williams, younger now, with less gray hair and fewer lines around his eyes, but with the same elegant posture and the same perfectly tailored suit, showed up at my apartment with a document that needed my signature. "Mrs. Jenkins," he introduced himself formally at the door of my apartment. "I am Charles Williams, legal representative of Mr. Ryan Jenkins. I have an important matter to discuss with you." The mention of Ryan's name made my heart race. For a brief, irrational moment, I thought he was coming back, that he'd repented, that he wanted a second chance with his family. But when I invited Charles in and he began explaining the reason for his visit, I realized the reality was very different. "Mr. Jenkins has established a trust for the benefit of his son, Jonathan," Charles explained, opening his leather briefcase to reveal official documents bearing seals and signatures. "I am here to inform you of this arrangement and obtain your signature agreeing to the terms." "Trust fund," I repeated, confused. What kind of trust fund? And why didn't Ryan mention it in his letter? Charles cleared his throat discreetly. "Mr. Jenkins has preferred to keep certain aspects of his financial affairs separate from his personal correspondence. The trust he established is for Jonathan's future, but with very specific conditions." "What conditions?" "The boy will only receive the money when he is 30, and only if he proves himself to be a person of good character. Someone who values genuine relationships, who demonstrates integrity, compassion, and respect for others. Especially for you, Mrs. Jenkins, the person who will be responsible for his upbringing. And who will judge whether he meets those criteria?" I asked, feeling a mixture of confusion and indignation rising within me. "You," Charles replied simply. "Ryan has left the final decision in your hands. My role is to discreetly observe Jonathan's development over the years, document his behavior, and present my observations when the time is right. But the final word will be yours." I felt an anger I had never felt before. "How much is in that trust fund, Mr. Williams?" "A considerable amount," was his vague reply. "How much?" I persisted, thinking that maybe I could use some of that money to help raise the son Ryan had abandoned, to give Jonathan the opportunities he deserved, to make our lives a little less financially suffocating. "Unfortunately, that's not possible," Charles explained, sounding genuinely regretful. "The conditions are very specific. The money is inaccessible until Jonathan turns 30, even for educational or medical needs." In that moment, I looked at that document, at those cold legal words, and felt an anger I'd never felt before. Ryan abandons us, leaves a 5-year-old son behind, and still thinks he has the right to judge that son's character from afar? To determine his financial future based on arbitrary criteria? To observe me as if I were some kind of experiment, evaluating my performance as a single mother? I almost tore up the paper right then and there, almost sent Charles Williams away with a few choice words about what Ryan could do with his trust fund and its conditions. But something stopped me. An inner voice telling me that, however unfair, that money could one day belong to Jonathan, and I had no right to deny him that. "How much?" I asked again, my voice low but firm. Charles hesitated, then reluctantly replied, "The initial value is approximately $20 million, invested for long-term growth." 20 million. The number made no sense to me. It was such an abstract sum, so divorced from the reality of our lives, that it seemed almost fictitious. I was worried about how to pay next month's rent, how to save for Jonathan's school supplies, and there was a $20 million fund waiting for him, untouchable until he turned 30. Where did this money come from? I asked, still trying to reconcile the Ryan I knew, the salesman who often complained about his nearly maxed-out credit cards, with this man who apparently had millions to his disposal. I am not authorized to discuss the origins of Mr. Jenkins's fortune, Charles replied politely. Only to administer the fund according to your instructions. I signed the document with trembling hands. Charles explained that he would watch from afar, that we would rarely have contact, and that I should not mention the existence of the trust to Jonathan. He needs to grow up without the expectation of wealth, he explained. He needs to form his character without that influence. I nodded, still stunned by everything, and Charles departed, leaving me alone with my son and a secret I would carry for decades. The years that followed were a constant struggle. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to maintain our small apartment and ensure Jonathan had what he needed. Not necessarily what he wanted or what his more affluent classmates had, but the essentials for a healthy and dignified childhood. I saved every penny I could, creating a small fund for his future education, determined that my son would have the opportunity to attend a good university, regardless of his father's choices. When he was 10, I got a better job as an accounting assistant at a construction company. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was stable, had benefits, and allowed me to finally finish my accounting degree in my spare time, attending night classes while an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Mitchell, cared for Jonathan. Gradually, our financial situation improved, from desperate to simply tight, from tight to manageable. Jonathan grew up a good boy. Intelligent, curious, determined like me, charming like his father. Sometimes it broke my heart, seeing traces of Ryan in him, hearing certain intonations in his voice that reminded me of the man who abandoned us. The way he tilted his head when he was focused, the crooked smile that appeared when he was up to mischief, the ease with which he made friends. These were all echoes of Ryan that constantly reminded me of what we lost, of what was taken from us. But Jonathan was his own person, unique and special, and I worked hard every day to make him feel loved, safe, and supported. I celebrated every small victory. His first A in math, his first soccer game won, his first Mother's Day poem, which I still keep in a special box along with other treasures from his childhood. As he entered high school, the questions about his father became more frequent and more difficult. It was no longer enough to say, "Dad left," that sometimes adults make decisions that hurt other people, that it wasn't your fault. He wanted to know why, he wanted to understand the motivations. He wanted details that I didn't have or didn't want to share fully. One night, after a school project on family trees that left Jonathan feeling particularly melancholic, I sat with him on our small couch and told him the truth as gently as possible. That his father had chosen a different path, that it had nothing to do with Jonathan, that it was a flaw in Ryan, not in us. I showed him the few photographs I had saved, told him some good stories from our time as a family, tried to give him something positive to hold on to amidst the loss. "Didn't he love us enough?" Jonathan asked, his small voice revealing the pain he hid daily behind his confident smile and carefree attitude. "Love is complicated," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "Some people don't know how to love the way others need. Some don't know how to stay, how to build something lasting. That doesn't mean you weren't worthy of love, Jonathan. It just means your father wasn't strong enough to be the man you deserved to have in your life." He seemed to accept this explanation, but I noticed a change in him after this conversation. A toughness that hadn't been there before, a determination to prove something to the world, or perhaps to his absent father. He became more focused on his studies, more committed to achieving excellence in everything he did. Sports, schoolwork, extracurricular projects. As if trying to build a resume impressive enough to make Ryan regret leaving, to show him what he lost by leaving this extraordinary son behind. Jonathan excelled in school, finishing in the top 10 of his class, and earned a partial scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Boston. I was immensely proud, but I knew we would still need more money. The scholarship only covered 60% of tuition, not including room, board, books, and other expenses. I used all my savings from the fund I had set up for his education, took out a supplemental student loan, and increased my workload. Jonathan also took on part-time jobs, waiting at a restaurant near campus on weekends, tutoring freshman math during the week. Together, we made it work, though often barely. It was during his sophomore year of college that he met Patricia. She was the only daughter of Richard and Susan Moore, a traditional Boston family with old money and important connections in the financial and political worlds. Patricia was studying business, as was Jonathan. They began working together on a marketing project and were soon dating. Initially, I was happy for him. Patricia seemed polite and intelligent, and Jonathan radiated happiness when he spoke of her. The first time I noticed something was wrong was when Jonathan brought me to dinner at Patricia's parents' house. A Beacon Hill mansion that looked like something out of a movie, with original artwork on the walls, antique furniture probably worth more than anything I'd ever earned, and waiters circulating discreetly, serving dishes with French names I could barely pronounce. I tried hard to appear at ease, to talk about topics I thought would interest them, to avoid making any social faux pas that would embarrass my son. But from the moment we walked in, I could feel the appraising glances, the discreetly raised eyebrows when I mentioned my job as an accountant at a mid-sized company, the condescending smiles when I confessed I'd never been to Europe. Richard Moore regarded me as if I were an anthropological curiosity, asking questions about my humble work with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's fascinating how people can get by on so little," he commented at one point, as if discussing an exotic species of animal. "You must have made a lot of sacrifices raising Jonathan alone." "Any mother would have done the same," I replied, maintaining my dignity despite my growing discomfort. "Oh, I'm not so sure about that," Susan interjected, sipping her expensive wine. "It takes a special kind of resilience to face so many limitations. And you must be so proud of how Jonathan overcame his background. He's surprisingly refined given the circumstances." I bit back the answer I wanted to give, reminding myself that I was there for Jonathan, that this was the family of the woman he loved, that creating conflict would only harm their relationship. I watched my son during dinner, noticing how he mimicked Richard's mannerisms, how he adjusted his vocabulary to sound more sophisticated, how he seemed to be auditioning for a role in a high society play. Jonathan seemed not to notice, or chose to ignore, the condescending comments, the small humiliations I was subjected to during that interminable dinner. I was so eager to be accepted by that family, so dazzled by the world they represented, that you didn't see how they treated me. Or maybe you did and didn't care. That thought hurt more than I wanted to admit. On the way home, I tried to broach the subject delicately. "Patricia's family seems very traditional." "They're amazing, aren't they?" he replied enthusiastically. "Richard practically built the company from scratch. And their house. Have you seen that library? Thousands of books, some first editions. And Patricia said that Monet in the dining room has been in the family for generations." "They seem very proud of their possessions," I commented, trying not to sound critical. "And they should be. They've earned it all through hard work and business acumen. Richard is teaching me so much, Mom. Things we would never learn in college alone. Real connections, how the business world really works." "Just be careful not to lose sight of who you are, Jonathan," I suggested gently. "You don't have to change to impress anyone." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Frustration, perhaps, or shame. "I'm not changing, Mom. I'm evolving, growing, experiencing a different world." "Isn't that what you always wanted for me? Opportunities you didn't have?" I didn't pursue the matter, but I left that dinner with an unsettling feeling. Something was changing in my son, something subtle but fundamental. And I feared we were just witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would push him further and further away from his roots, his original values, and me. After graduation, Jonathan landed a job at Patricia's father's company. Richard placed him in the finance department, promising rapid advancement if he demonstrated competence. It was an opportunity most recent graduates would dream of, with a starting salary nearly double what I was earning after years of experience. Jonathan moved into an apartment in a posh Boston neighborhood, began wearing expensive suits, frequenting exclusive restaurants, and living a life straight out of a lifestyle magazine for the rich and famous. Our phone conversations became shorter and less frequent. His visits to my modest apartment gradually diminished, from weekly to bi-weekly to monthly, until they became sporadic encounters scheduled in advance as professional appointments. When he did come, he seemed uncomfortable, looking around as if in a foreign country, disconcerted by the simplicity that had once been his home. On one of these rare visits, about a year after graduation, I noticed a different glint in his eyes, a nervous energy that wasn't typical of him. "I have news," he announced as we ate the lasagna he'd prepared especially for his visit. "I asked Patricia to marry me last night. She said yes." "Oh, Jonathan," I exclaimed, genuinely happy for him despite my reservations about the Moore family's influence. "That's wonderful. Congratulations." "Thank you, Mom." He smiled, that smile that reminded me of the boy he'd been. It was perfect. I booked the private room at Le Bernardin, hired a violinist, and there were roses everywhere. She must have been delighted. "It is," he confirmed, reaching for his phone. "Look at the ring. It's a vintage Tiffany piece, 3-carat diamond, platinum." I looked at the photo, struck not only by the obviously expensive piece of jewelry, but also by the financial implications of such a purchase. "It's beautiful. It must have cost." "Don't worry about it," he interrupted quickly, a slight blush appearing on his face. "I've been saving, and Richard helped me get a good deal through a friend in the jewelry business." The ring was worth more than my car. Much more, probably. Jonathan seemed strangely distant as he broke the news, as if he were informing me about a business development, not sharing one of the most important moments of his life. When I asked about the wedding plans, he quickly explained that Patricia's parents were taking care of everything, that it would be a big event, and that I didn't need to worry about a thing. "Not even with the dress," he added, as if he were doing me a huge favor. "Patricia says her mom knows a great boutique where you can find something appropriate." The hesitation before the last word said it all. I wasn't suitable for their world. I needed to be changed, improved, presented in a way that wouldn't embarrass them. "I can pick out my own dress, Jonathan," I replied calmly, trying not to show how hurt his words were. "I'm sure I can find something suitable for the occasion." Sure, he replied quickly. "I'm just saying they have connections. They know the right places. Susan just wants to help." "Susan has barely spoken to me the 3 times we've met," I observed. "I doubt you're looking forward to spending an afternoon shopping with me." Jonathan sighed, running his hand through his hair, a gesture he'd made since childhood when he felt frustrated. "Why do you have to complicate things, Mom? They're trying to be kind, to include you. Is that so hard to accept?" "I'm not complicating anything, Jonathan. I'm just being honest about the dynamics that exist. The Moores have never made a point of really getting to know me or accepting me. They tolerate my existence because I'm their mother, nothing more. Maybe if you made more of an effort to fit in." He began, then stopped, realizing what he was about to say. "Fit in," I repeated, feeling a pang of hurt and indignation. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Pretend I have a 7-figure bank account? Invent an aristocratic pedigree? Deny everything I am and everything we've done together?" "That's not what I meant," he replied defensively. "I just think you could be more flexible, less sensitive to every comment. Not everything is a personal attack, Mom." I looked at my son, this stranger in expensive clothes who barely recognized the man he had become, and felt a deep sadness. "I don't want to argue, Jonathan. It's your engagement. It should be a happy time. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you and want your happiness above all else." He visibly relaxed, relieved I wasn't pressing the issue. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me. And you'll love the wedding, I promise. It will be the event of the year." Over the next few months, I was consistently excluded from the preparations. I received a formal invitation in the mail, like any other distant guest. Printed on thick ivory paper, with embossed gold lettering and an elegant monogram, P&J, intertwined in a design that surely cost more than my weekly food budget. When I called Jonathan to ask about my participation in the ceremony, he seemed uncomfortable. "Mom, we're doing things a little differently. Richard will walk me down the aisle, since I don't have a father present. And Susan will walk with Patricia. It's more traditional." Traditional. The word echoed in my head. What could be more traditional than a single mother attending her own wedding? But I swallowed my resentment, as I had so many times before. This was Jonathan's day, not mine. If he wanted things this way, I would respect it. A week before the wedding, I received a call from Patricia. It was the first time she had called me directly, always preferring Jonathan to mediate our limited communication. "Eleanor," she began, without any warm greeting, "I'm calling to confirm that you will be coming alone to the wedding." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, Patricia. I'll be alone, as the invitation says." "Great." The coolness in his voice was palpable. "And did you get any dress code? Nothing too colorful or flashy, right? The dress code is smart formal." I'd saved for months for a simple yet dignified navy blue dress. I'd researched mother of the groom styles, trying to find something elegant without being extravagant, something that would make me look dignified without drawing attention to myself. "Yes, I completely understand." "Perfect." There was a pause. "You know, Eleanor, Jonathan really values his relationship with my parents. Richard has been like a real father figure to him these past few years." The pang I felt was immediate and profound. "I'm glad he found this figure in his life," I managed to say, struggling to maintain my composure. "Yes, it's a shame he didn't have this sooner. A suitable male role model would have made a world of difference. But anyway, we're moving on, aren't we?" She laughed lightly, as if we were sharing a friendly joke, not as if she were belittling all my efforts as a single mother. "Anyway, we're very much looking forward to welcoming you on the big day. Your table is well placed." "I'm sure it will be a beautiful ceremony," I replied, refusing to fall for the teasing. "It will be perfect," Patricia corrected. "Absolutely perfect. We hired the best planner in Boston. The same one who planned Senator Mitchell's daughter's wedding last year." "Wonderful. I can't wait to see it. Jonathan is so happy," she continued, her voice taking on an almost dreamy tone. "You know, he often tells me how different I am from you. How I helped him discover his true potential, to overcome the limitations of his upbringing." The pain of those words was so intense that for a moment I was speechless. Did Jonathan really say those things? Did he really see our life together as a limitation to be overcome, not as the loving foundation I'd always tried to provide despite the difficulties? "Well, I'm glad he found someone who makes him feel fulfilled," I finally managed to say. "All I ever wanted was his happiness." "Of course," Patricia replied, her voice sweet as poison. "All mothers want that. So we'll see you on the big day, Eleanor. Remember, arrive at least an hour early for family photos." When I hung up, I couldn't hold back the tears I'd been holding back throughout the entire conversation. I hadn't cried like this in years, not since the first few months after Ryan abandoned me. I wept for the son I was losing, for the daughter-in-law who despised me, for the injustice of it all. But then, slowly, the sadness began to give way to something else. Determination. I would attend that wedding with my head held high. I would show them that Eleanor Jenkins was not someone to be intimidated or belittled. And so it was that I found myself at table 27, at the back of the wedding hall, next to Charles Williams and his unspoken knowledge of the $45 million that would change our lives. During the reception, as we watched the bride and groom dance their first waltz as husband and wife under a canopy of expensive flowers, he told me the full story, a tale that would change my perception of the past and redefine my future. "Ryan Jenkins wasn't who you thought," Charles began, sipping champagne from a crystal flute. "When I met him, he was already sick. Terminal brain cancer. The doctors gave him less than a year to live." My world stopped. Was Ryan dying when he left me? Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he let us help him, be with him in his final moments? He didn't want you and Jonathan to see him wasting away, Charles continued, as if reading my thoughts. But most of all, he didn't want you to know about the money. What money? I asked, confused. Ryan came from an extremely wealthy family, Eleanor Jenkins of New England, who owned one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country until its sale to an international conglomerate in the 1990s. Ryan was the only son, heir to a considerable fortune. But he broke off relations with his parents at a young age, determined to make his own way, disgusted with what he saw as the materialistic and superficial values of high society. I tried to reconcile this revelation with the man I had met, a charming, down-to-earth salesman who was thrilled when he landed a bonus commission, who carefully calculated our household budget, who never showed any signs of having access to any wealth. When you met him, Charles explained, he was living entirely from his own work, refusing any contact or support from his family. It was a matter of principle for him. He wanted to prove that he could build a life on his own merits, not on the accident of his birth. But then, what changed? The disease, Charles replied simply. When he learned of the diagnosis, approximately 6 months before leaving them, Ryan was forced to confront his mortality. He reconciled with his parents, who were already elderly and eager to reconnect with their only son. It was in this process that he discovered he was the sole heir to a fortune even greater than he had imagined, as his parents had invested wisely after selling the company. The revelations continued, each more startling than the last. Ryan had left not to abandon us, but to die far away, to spare us the pain of his slow, degrading loss. He didn't want his last image in Jonathan's mind to be of a frail father, consumed by illness, unable to play or interact. He left that $5,000 as a temporary lifeline until I found my way, firmly believing I was strong enough to carry on. Couldn't you have told me the truth? I asked, my voice shaking with conflicting emotions. Didn't you trust me to be strong enough to help you face your illness? It wasn't a matter of strength, Eleanor, Charles replied gently. Ryan had seen what wealth did to people, how it distorted values, created unrealistic expectations, destroyed character. He didn't want that for Jonathan. He wanted his son to grow up valuing the things that truly matter: hard work, honesty, compassion. And he believed, perhaps wrongly, that the only way to ensure that was to keep the money secret, to create strict conditions for its use. The trust fund was his legacy to Jonathan, Charles explained, but it was conditioned on several clauses. The money would only be released if Jonathan demonstrated integrity, compassion, and appreciation for genuine relationships over material wealth. If he became the kind of man Ryan expected, not defined by possessions or status, but by character. And who judges whether he meets those criteria? I asked, still processing all these revelations. You, Charles replied simply. Ryan left explicit instructions. We would observe Jonathan until he was 30, but the final decision would be yours, Eleanor. He trusted your judgment completely. Why didn't you ever tell me this before? Charles sighed. Ryan's instructions were to reveal everything only when necessary. I've maintained discreet contact over the years, observing from afar. Recently, I began to notice troubling changes in Jonathan's behavior, especially after his involvement with the Moore family. When I learned about the wedding and saw how you were being treated, I decided it was time to appear in person and reveal the truth. And how much exactly is that $45 million? I asked, still in disbelief at the magnitude of the situation. Actually, it's $62 million now, with the investments of the last few years, Charles corrected. And there's one more thing you should know. He paused, taking another sip of champagne. Half of the trust fund is yours, Eleanor. Regardless of the decision regarding Jonathan. Ryan determined that you would receive your share once Jonathan turned 30, or whenever a decision regarding his share was necessary. Since we seem to have reached this point. $31 million. The amount echoed in my mind like an abstract number, without real meaning. I, who had counted pennies to buy school supplies, who had worked double shifts to pay the rent, who had sewn and mended clothes until they were no longer wearable, was now about to become a millionaire. Why would Ryan do that? I asked, feeling a confused mix of emotions. After leaving us like that. He loved you both, Eleanor. In his own complicated and imperfect way, but he loved you. He believed you deserved security after years of raising Jonathan alone. But he also wanted his son to grow up with true values, not dependent on an inheritance. The band played a slow song while guests helped themselves to drinks and desserts. I saw Jonathan and Patricia circulating among distant tables, greeting important guests, without approaching my area. The reality of the situation began to sink in. What happens now? I asked Charles. That's up to you. We can reveal the existence of the trust fund to Jonathan tomorrow, as planned. You can decide whether he's demonstrated the character necessary to receive his share. Or we can delay, give him more time to mature. I watched my son from across the room, so different from the boy I'd raised, now almost unrecognizable in his expensive suit and practiced smile meant to please Boston's elite. He'd left me at table 27, had allowed his fiancée and in-laws to treat me like an embarrassing inconvenience. The boy who'd once cried in my arms when he fell off his bike, who'd made Mother's Day cards out of glued-on macaroni and glitter, who'd vowed it would always be the two of us against the world, could now barely look me in the eye. But I still remembered who he really was, beneath that facade. The boy with a kind heart who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, who defended younger children on the playground, who cried at movies about abandoned animals. Did that Jonathan still exist somewhere? We'll reveal the background tomorrow, I finally decided. But I won't make a decision about his character right away. I want to see how he reacts, what this reveals about who he really is now. Charles nodded in approval. A wise approach. We'll meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. in my office. Jonathan and Patricia have been informed that they need to be present to sign some documents regarding wedding gifts. I spent the rest of the reception surveying the room, feeling strangely detached from everything. The knowledge I now possessed gave me a new perspective. I was no longer the poor, insignificant mother relegated to the forgotten table. I was Eleanor Jenkins, a woman who had raised a son alone for 25 years, who had survived abandonment and hardship, and who was now about to wield power the more family could never have imagined. The official photographer circled the ballroom, capturing carefully orchestrated moments. The first toast, the bride's parents dancing, the groomsmen laughing around a table. He never approached table 27. It was as if that corner of the ballroom didn't officially exist, as if the people there were mere extras in the background, not actual participants in the celebration. You know, Charles commented, watching my expression as I followed the photographer with my eyes. I've watched Jonathan since he was a child. From afar, of course, as Ryan instructed. I saw the boy you raised, kind, hardworking, respectful. I saw his struggles and triumphs, his moments of doubt and his achievements. The young man who got into college on that scholarship was someone any parent would be proud of. But in recent years, especially since meeting the Moores, there's been a transformation. As if he's trying to become someone completely different. Someone I suspect he doesn't even fully recognize. The Moores dazzled him, I replied, watching Patricia laugh artificially at something a guest said. The money, the prestige, the connections, all things he never had with us. It's hard to resist that kind of seduction when you grew up with so little. That's precisely why Ryan set the terms of the trust fund the way he did, Charles noted. He wanted Jonathan to be tested, to face exactly this kind of moral choice, between authentic values and superficial appearances. The question now is, what will the current version of Jonathan choose when he learns the truth tomorrow? When the party ended, I looked for Jonathan to say goodbye. I found him in the lobby, chatting animatedly with some friends from college. I approached cautiously, hoping he'd notice me. When he finally saw me, there was a barely perceptible flash of something in his eyes. Embarrassment? Guilt? Before he gave me a polite smile. "Mom, are you leaving already?" he asked, giving me a quick, perfunctory hug, the kind of greeting you give to a casual acquaintance, not the woman who raised you. "Yes," It's getting late. It was a beautiful ceremony, Jonathan. You both look very happy. Thanks for coming. Her response was mechanical, as if thanking a colleague who was far from work for her presence. Can you get a taxi? I need. Don't worry, I interrupted gently. I already called an Uber. Oh, and by the way, Attorney Charles Williams asked me to remind you that you have a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. at his office. Something about documents related to wedding gifts. Jonathan frowned. Lawyer? What lawyer? The gentleman who was sitting next to me at the table said that you and Patricia received notification about the meeting. Oh yes, he replied vaguely. Patricia must know about this. Probably something her parents arranged. He checked his watch. I have to go back inside. We're about to cut the cake. Sure, I smiled softly. Go ahead. See you tomorrow then. He was already walking away before I even finished the sentence, without looking back, without realizing the meaning of that, see you tomorrow. I returned to my small apartment that night with a strange sense of calm. For years, I had blamed myself for Jonathan's withdrawal, wondering if I had failed as a mother in some way. Now I realized it wasn't my faults, but his choices. And tomorrow, those choices would be tested in ways he could never have foreseen. I sat in the modestly furnished living room where Jonathan had grown up, where we had shared so many moments. Board game nights on rainy days, study sessions for difficult exams, conversations about his dreams and fears. It felt like another life now. I looked at the framed photographs on the wall. Jonathan on his first day of school, smiling with missing teeth, a proud teenager with his debate trophy, a young adult at his college graduation. A progression of moments that documented our journey together. I wondered what my life would be like with $31 million. The number was so large that I couldn't really grasp its magnitude. I could buy a house, not a lavish mansion like the Moores, but something nice, maybe with a small garden. I could travel, see places I'd always wanted to see but never had. I could retire from accounting, maybe start a small foundation to help single mothers, give back in some way. But money wouldn't solve everything. It wouldn't bring back the son I once knew. It wouldn't heal the pain of seeing how he'd changed, how he'd distanced himself from everything I'd tried to teach him. Perhaps, however, tomorrow's revelations could at least begin a process of rapprochement, of rediscovery. With these thoughts, I prepared for bed, knowing that the next day would be a turning point in our lives. The next morning, I arrived at Charles Williams's office 20 minutes early. It was an imposing building in Boston's financial district, with marble in the lobby and a receptionist who treated me with surprising deference when I mentioned my name. I was shown to a conference room on the 15th floor, with panoramic views of the harbor, where Charles was already waiting for me. Good morning, Eleanor, he greeted, standing to greet me. Did you sleep well? Surprisingly, yes, I replied honestly. After so many years of carrying secrets, I feel like I can finally breathe. Charles nodded understandingly. Ryan would be proud of how you handled everything. He always said you were the strongest person he'd ever met. Those words stirred something inside me. Even after so many years, even now knowing the truth about his passing, Ryan's approval still meant something. Maybe because, on some level, I still loved the man he had been, the father of my son, before illness and circumstances took him from us. You said you've been watching Jonathan over the years, I commented, as Charles poured me a cup of coffee. How exactly did that work? I never noticed anyone monitoring us. Charles smiled. I was very discreet, as Ryan requested. I received reports on his school activities, followed his milestones through strategic contacts, teachers, counselors, even some of his closest friends from when he was in college. Nothing invasive, just enough to form a picture of his development. And what did you see? An exceptional young man, for the most part. Someone who, despite his father's absence and financial hardship, developed a strong sense of ethics, compassion for others, and determination. You did a remarkable job, Eleanor. Until the Moores came into the picture, I finished bitterly. Money and status have a seductive power over young people, especially those who grew up without them, Charles observed. The real question is whether the core values you instilled in them will survive that seduction. Promptly at 10 a.m., the receptionist announced the arrival of Jonathan and Patricia. I adjusted my simple dress, took a deep breath, and prepared myself for what was to come. When they entered the room, the surprise on their faces was immediate. Jonathan seemed genuinely confused to see me there, while Patricia could barely hide her displeasure. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Jonathan asked, stopping abruptly. Charles took the initiative, extending his hand. "Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Jenkins, I'm Charles Williams, the Jenkins family's longtime attorney. Please be seated." "The Moore Jenkins family," Patricia corrected automatically, shaking Charles's hand with an appraising look. "And I don't understand. What Jenkins family? There's only Eleanor and Jonathan, and as far as I know, they've never needed legal services." The condescension in his voice was palpable, but Charles merely smiled politely. "Actually, Mrs. Moore Jenkins, there's much more to the Jenkins family than you realize. Please be seated. We have important matters to discuss." Jonathan and Patricia sat down reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable. I noticed Jonathan avoided looking directly at me, as if my presence were a reminder of something he'd rather forget. Charles opened a folder and began. "We are here today to discuss the Jenkins Trust Fund, established by Ryan Jenkins, Jonathan's father, approximately 25 years ago." The shock on Jonathan's face was instantaneous. "Trust fund? What trust fund? My father abandoned us when I was 5. He left me nothing but..." He stopped, realizing he was about to say something very personal in front of his wife. $5,000, I finished softly. "And a signed divorce decree." Charles continued calmly. "Mr. Jenkins, your father was not who you think. Ryan Jenkins came from an extremely wealthy family, though he chose to live independently of that wealth for most of his adult life. When he discovered he was terminally ill, he established a substantial trust fund in your name." Patricia leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "How substantial are we talking?" Charles glanced at me, as if asking for permission. I nodded slightly. "The current value of the trust fund is approximately $62 million. The silence that followed was deafening. I saw Patricia's eyes widen, her lips part in shock. Jonathan looked as if he'd been physically struck, all the blood draining from his face. This can't be right," he finally managed to say. "My father was a salesman. We lived in a small apartment. He had no money. Your father chose to live modestly, rejecting the family fortune until he learned of your illness," Charles explained. "It was a matter of principle for him." "What disease?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Terminal brain cancer. The doctors gave him less than a year. He didn't want you and your mother to see him deteriorate. He chose to leave, allowing you to cherish the memories of him in good health." I saw tears form in Jonathan's eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I glimpsed again the boy he had been, instead of the distant man he had become. Why didn't he ever tell us? Why did he let us think he'd abandoned us? The pain in his voice was palpable. "Your father had very specific views on money and character," Charles explained. "He wanted to protect you from the potentially corrupting effects of wealth, to ensure you grew up valuing the right things: hard work, honesty, genuine connections." Patricia, however, had already gotten over her initial shock and was now actively calculating the implications. "So, Jonathan is heir to $62 million? When can we access this? Is there a form to sign today?" His immediate transition from shock to financial planning was revealing. Not a word about Ryan's illness, how this revelation affected Jonathan emotionally, or what it meant for his understanding of his own story. Just interest in the millions and how to get them quickly. Charles adjusted his glasses. "Actually, the trust fund has specific conditions. Half of it, $31 million, belongs to Eleanor, as recognition for the years she spent raising Jonathan alone." He turned to me. That portion is immediately available to you, Eleanor, without any conditions. Patricia seemed unable to process this information, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. You're getting $31 million? Now. I nodded silently, watching the transformation in her face. Suddenly, I was no longer the embarrassing mother-in-law of humble origins, but someone of significant interest. And the other half? Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse. Charles continued. The other half is reserved for you, Jonathan. However, there is one important condition. Your father stipulated that you would only receive the money if you demonstrated yourself to be a person of good character, someone who valued genuine relationships over material gain, someone who treated others, especially your mother, with respect and consideration. The silence returned, this time charged with a palpable tension. And who determines whether he meets those criteria? Patricia finally asked, a defensive tone in her voice. Eleanor, Charles replied simply. Ryan left the final decision in her hands. Jonathan's eyes finally met mine, true panic evident in them. In that moment, he completely understood. All the times he'd cast me aside, all the times he'd allowed Patricia and her parents to treat me with disdain, all the times he'd been ashamed of my humble origins, all of it now had a potential price tag of $31 million. Patricia recovered quickly, her face transforming into a mask of warmth. Eleanor, what wonderful news for you. You deserve every penny, after everything you've done for Jonathan. We always talk about how much we admire your strength and dedication, don't we, dear? The ease with which she switched her demeanor was almost impressive. From barely concealed condescension to open flattery in a matter of seconds, all at the prospect of money. Jonathan seemed unable to speak, torn between the shock of the revelations about his father and the realization of the power I now held over his financial future. Actually, I continued calmly, I haven't made my decision about Jonathan's part yet. I need some time to think it over. Of course, Patricia quickly agreed. Such an important decision shouldn't be rushed. In the meantime, perhaps we could have dinner together tonight? To celebrate this incredible news. In our new house. I mean, you haven't seen our apartment yet, have you? The same apartment I wasn't invited to for housewarming. The same apartment that, according to Jonathan, was too small for large gatherings. That would be lovely, I replied with a soft smile. Thank you for the invitation. Charles intervened. If I may suggest, perhaps it would be best if Eleanor and Jonathan could spend some time together first. Alone. There's much they need to process and discuss. The panic in Patricia's eyes was momentary, but telling. Oh, of course. Although I hate to miss this special family gathering. You will have many opportunities in the future, I assured, silently savoring the irony of my own words. It was agreed that Jonathan and I would have lunch together that day. Charles would arrange for my share of the trust fund to be transferred to an account in my name and schedule another meeting the following week to discuss my decision regarding Jonathan's share. When the meeting ended, Jonathan and Patricia got up to leave. Patricia gave me an awkward, forced hug, the first in all the years we'd known each other. I'm so happy for you, Eleanor. And I can't wait to spend more time together. Maybe we could go shopping sometime? I know all the best boutiques in Boston. The same woman who the day before had looked at me as if I were an embarrassing inconvenience now wanted to be my shopping companion. The transformation would be comical if it weren't so transparent. He returned the hug politely, without commenting on her sudden change in attitude. When she left the room, Jonathan remained behind, still visibly shaken. Mom, he began, but couldn't seem to find the words. See you for lunch, Jonathan, he said gently. We'll have time to talk then. He nodded and left, his shoulders slumped as if carrying a new, invisible weight. When we were alone, Charles looked at me with a look of respect. You handled this admirably, Eleanor. Many people would have revealed their decision immediately, whether out of revenge or relief. It's not about revenge, I replied honestly. It's about giving Jonathan a chance to see clearly the path he's chosen. Sometimes we need to lose something, or fear losing it, to understand what we truly value. Charles nodded. Ryan was right about you. You've always been the strongest person in this family. If you've made it this far, you probably recognize that families aren't always what we imagine, right? Here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are told without judgment. These stories will move you, make you reflect, and perhaps even help you better understand your own family experiences. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters and where you're always welcome. If you identified with my story, leave a like to help me reach more people, and in the comments, tell me, have you ever been in a situation where you were underestimated by family members and then had the opportunity to show your true worth? Your story can inspire others who are going through difficult times right now.